journey towards civil rights has had many troubled stops along the way. But I, for one, agree with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that the arc of history bends towards justice. And I also agree with the vision that Dr. King put forth standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to an assembled crowd, an assembled protest, that he wanted to live in a nation where we would be judged, all of us would be judged, not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. That is a vision that has animated America on our journey towards justice. An outrage at what happened to George Floyd prompted Americans across this country to speak out, to exercise their First Amendment right, to speak out for racial justice, to speak out against police brutality, to speak out against abuse of power. All of that is legitimate. All of that's protected by the Constitution. But then we saw things take an ominous turn, a dangerous turn. What for some was legitimate First Amendment speech, speaking out for justice, became co-opted, became taken over by violent, criminal radicals. Now let's be clear, because so much of the news media does not like clarity in this regard. When I say that, I am not saying that everybody speaking is a violent criminal radical. Indeed, there are a great many people speaking out whose heart cries for justice, cries for the justice that has been the many centuries-long journey of this country. But there are radicals who cynically took advantage of these protests to sow division, to sow fear, to engage in murder, to engage in violent assaults, to engage in looting, to engage in theft, to engage in intimidation, to engage in fear. The First Amendment protects your right to speak. The First Amendment protects your right to peaceably protest. But none of us have a right to violently assault another person. None of us have a right to murder another person. None of us have a right to burn the cars of police officers, to shatter the shop windows of shops throughout this country, to engage in acts of terror threatening the lives of our fellow Americans. And to those radicals who cynically tried to co-opt these protests, I will say their actions were profoundly racist, because they were making a decision to take what should have been a unifying moment to say, this will not stand in our nation. Our law protects everyone regardless of the color of their skin, every American, African American, Hispanic, white, Asian American, it doesn't matter, our laws protect everyone. That should have been a unifying moment, and these cynical, violent, radical criminals decided to co-opt these protests to turn them in far too many instances, into riots. Violent riots terrorizing their fellow citizens. George Floyd was a native Houstonian. My hometown, I loved the city of Houston. George Floyd was active in his church in Houston. Next week, Mr. Floyd will be coming back to Houston for the last time, to be buried in Houston. I'm proud that last night in the city of Houston, thousands came out to protest. And there wasn't violence last night. That the people of Houston demonstrated that you can speak for racial justice, you can speak out against brutality without engaging in violence. But there's been too much violence across the country. And sadly, too many politicians who are complicit in the violence. who have made the political judgment to turn a blind eye to rioters, to thugs, to murderers, to those terrorizing communities. The riots must stop. The violence must stop. The first responsibility of government is to keep people